the price of crude oil just moved. Why? Because global stability doesn't end on a battlefield. Sometimes it dies in the middle of the ocean, $1 billion seizure at a time. Today, a single oil tanker became ground zero for a chilling new geopolitical confrontation. If you want clear, urgent updates on how these global power tests affect your life and your wallet, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel to track every move in this evolving crisis. This isn't just a dispute over barrels, this is a high-stakes standoff that threatens the very pipelines of global trade, potentially triggering economic chaos worldwide. Picture the scene. A massive vessel, a floating fortress of crude, suddenly goes dark in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. U.S. forces move in, executing a swift, surgical takeover of the vessel. Within hours, the narrative explodes. Washington insisted this was a lawful operation, a necessary enforcement action against a ghost ship connected to Moscow's shadow fleet, a vessel allegedly violating critical international sanctions. But Russia's reaction was immediate and venomous. Illegal. Moscow instantly labeled the U.S. action an act of maritime piracy, a profound breach of the sacred rules governing the high seas. Russian officials stated that stopping and commandeering the vessel was simply unacceptable, accusing Washington of deploying military force in waters where freedom of navigation is supposed to be absolute. This is more than just a fight over a single shipment. This incident pulls back the curtain on a hidden struggle, the alleged shadow fleet. These are the vessels Western governments claim operate under shifting identities and false flags, secretly moving oil and undermining years of economic restrictions designed to pressure Moscow. The tension is real because the relationship between Washington and Moscow is already stretched to its absolute limit. The war in Ukraine, crippling sanctions, and relentless military posturing have pushed these two global giants into one of the most fragile phases of their relationship in decades. So the biggest question now is unavoidable. Did this seizure push us closer to a military flashpoint at sea? The immediate answer, thankfully, is no. There was no exchange of fire, no missiles were launched, there has been no open naval confrontation. What we are witnessing is a serious diplomatic conflict, a high-stakes legal argument, played out with statements and international pressure instead of firepower. But experts warn this incident signals two dangerous truths simultaneously. First, the United States is signaling that it will strictly and actively enforce its economic sanctions. Second, Russia is signaling that it will not quietly accept actions it views as a fundamental violation of international law. This is a cold contest for power, influence, and who ultimately controls the rules governing the world's oceans. Today it was an oil tanker. Tomorrow it could be the spark that ignites a much larger crisis. This was not a peaceful stop. It was a high-seas confrontation where control shifted rapidly, violently. The moment U.S. forces boarded that massive vessel, the diplomatic floodgates opened. For Washington, the move was completely justified. They claimed it was a necessary enforcement action against a tanker accused of funneling illicit funds and violating strict international sanctions. They claim lawful authority, stating they acted entirely within the existing legal framework. But Moscow's counterpunch was instant and brutal. The Kremlin didn't just disagree, they screamed foul play. Russia didn't see law enforcement. They saw an act of aggression, a profound violation of established international maritime law. Russian officials stated unequivocally, halting and commandeering a private vessel in open water is absolutely unacceptable. They immediately accused Washington of recklessly using force in international territory. The rhetoric quickly escalated past mere diplomatic condemnation. Russian lawmakers didn't mince words. They didn't call it a mistake. They called it piracy. That word, piracy, is a deliberate strategic escalation, equating the actions of a superpower to those of common criminals lurking off the coast of Somalia. The message reverberating from the Duma was chillingly clear. The United States has crossed an irreversible boundary. This wasn't just about enforcing banking codes or trade rules. This was about asserting brute force on the global stage. This singular maritime confrontation transcends the fate of one single vessel. Inscreva-se no canal para acompanhar este thriller geopolítico e saber o que este petroleiro realmente representa. This tanker is believed to be carrying, out in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic, a shadow operation unfolded. U.S. naval forces didn't just detain the ship. They executed a forceful military takeover. And the Kremlin's response was immediate and incandescent. It wasn't a diplomatic note, it was a single explosive accusation. Illegal, Washington framed the entire incident as routine police work, a lawful enforcement of existing international sanctions against a vessel tied directly to Moscow's network. They claimed every action was justified, legal, and necessary to uphold the global financial order. But Russia dismissed the legal rationale entirely. They saw the deployment of U.S. military muscle in international waters not as enforcement, but as a direct assault on national sovereignty. Russian officials declared the entire seizure unacceptable. The rhetoric quickly spun out of control. Lawmakers in Moscow didn't just protest, they labeled the American operation with the most venomous term in maritime law: piracy. Think about that. A global superpower, a NATO member, being openly accused of state-sponsored piracy on the high seas. The message booming from the Duma was unmistakable. America has crossed an irreversible threshold of aggression. This wasn't merely about disrupting trade flow. This was about asserting brute unilateral force. This singular confrontation transcends the fate of one single vessel because this tanker is believed to be carrying the most venomous term in maritime law: piracy. Think about that. A global superpower, a NATO member, being openly accused of state-sponsored piracy on the high seas. The message booming from the Duma was unmistakable. America has crossed an irreversible threshold of aggression. This wasn't merely about disrupting trade flow, this was about asserting brute, unilateral force. This singular confrontation transcends the fate of one single vessel because this tanker is believed to be carrying a massive payload of crude oil. But forget the cargo for a moment. If you want the full breakdown of how these global shadow wars unfold and what the long-term consequences of this confrontation will be, hit that subscribe button right now. Subscribe to the channel to follow the definitive analysis of geopolitical conflicts. The facts of the seizure are clinical, but the execution was anything but. Picture the scene. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in the black solitude of international waters, a massive oil tanker is suddenly interdicted. It wasn't the Coast Guard waving a warning flag. According to the immediate reports, U.S. forces took control. Within hours of the operation, the silence was shattered by a single sharp word from Moscow: illegal. So, what exactly happened? U.S. officials confirmed the interception. They claim the vessel, though not necessarily flying the Russian flag, was unequivocally linked to Russian interests and was engaged in a flagrant violation of existing economic sanctions. For Washington, this was a lawful, necessary enforcement action, a surgical strike to uphold the international rules they helped define. But Russia sees this as a declaration of maritime war. Moscow issued an immediate and absolutely scorching response, declaring the hostile takeover an unacceptable breach of international maritime law. They weren't debating fine print. They were accusing the United States of using sheer unilateral force in waters where no nation holds jurisdiction. For many Russian lawmakers, the action didn't just resemble piracy, it was the definition of it. In simple terms, the message from the Kremlin is definitive. The United States has ripped up the rulebook. This isn't just about controlling one ship. It's about testing the world to see if anyone dares challenge the new reality of America's unrestrained power on the high seas. The Atlantic Ocean is a vast, silent stage, and now it has become a geopolitical flashpoint. This isn't merely a dispute over crude oil or paper sanctions. This is about challenging the last vestiges of global order. When the U.S. Navy moved to stop that vessel, they didn't just seize cargo. They seized the entire concept of freedom of navigation. If you want to track the global chess match that defines our era, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications now. According to Washington, the capture was a clean, lawful execution of policy. American officials claim the ship was part of a ghost fleet, carrying Russian-linked crude oil, revenue designed to fuel conflict, in direct violation of existing international restrictions. They framed the interception as necessary police work, asserting that the rulebook they were following was sanctioned by the highest offices. For the White House, the action was perfectly legal, but Moscow saw the action through a completely different lens. The response from the Kremlin was immediate, sharp, and absolute: illegal. They reject the American premise entirely. Russian officials stated that intercepting and taking command of a vessel in international waters, based solely on a unilateral decree, is a gross violation of established maritime law, a move that fundamentally undermines the global consensus on the high seas. They accused the United States of turning the open ocean into an American lake, carving out zones of control where only U.S. domestic policy applies. For some Russian legislators, this wasn't just a tough sanction enforcement. It was an act of economic warfare indistinguishable from state-sponsored piracy. The message is unambiguous. The world has witnessed the United States cross a critical line. This precedent suggests that if the U.S. believes you are defying their sanctions, the protections of international waters simply cease to exist. This single, violent maritime skirmish transforms the high seas from a shared global commons into a new, dangerous battlefield, where the only law that matters is who possesses the largest fleet. The world now waits, holding its breath to see if this unilateral seizure is the start of a new, lawless global normal.